Let's look at how to achieve a tone-mapped HDR result using just one raw image in Affinity Photo. This is the image I've chosen to use, and if we move across to the EXIF panel, we can see on the exposure bias entry here that I've deliberately underexposed this image to try and capture some more highlight detail at the expense of some shadow detail. Before we can tone map this, however, we need to change one crucial setting, and that is located on the assistant options up here. We need to change raw output format from 16-bit to 32-bit HDR. Notice when we do this that tone curve defaults to take no action. We need to leave this set to take no action because if we apply the default tone curve, then it will clamp or clip the out-of-bound values, and we need those values because we're going to tone map them back into standard dynamic range. We'll close that dialog, and that setting does not actually take effect until the next raw file is loaded. So we can cancel out of developing this current raw file and then reopen it using File and Open Recent. Before I do that, however, I will just point out that you don't need a raw file open to change that setting. So we're in the photo persona at the moment with no document open. We can go to Assistant Options here and then click through to Develop Assistant and change our setting there. So we could actually change this before we even open our raw image. Okay, I'll just go to File, Open Recent and reopen that raw file. And this time what we want to do is bring the exposure slider up and get a nice base exposure for the foreground detail. So we are not concerned with the fact that we're clipping this highlight detail. Because our output is now 32-bit HDR, it is unbounded, meaning although these values appear clipped on our display, they're actually still stored in the document, which means we can access them to tone map them. What else will I do? I'll enable profiles, set my output profile to ROM RGB, which is essentially ProPhoto, so it's a wider color space than sRGB. And also, just looking at the noise profile here, I'll go to the details panel and just increase the luminance noise reduction, just to take the edge off the noise in the image. Okay, so we can now click Develop, and we will move into the main photo persona. So now we need to tone map this and bring all of those out-of-bound highlight values back into range. Before we actually move on, at this point, if you have a high dynamic range or extended dynamic range compatible display, you can go to View Studio and enable the 32-bit preview panel. Okay, and you can check Enable EDR or HDR if you're on Windows, and that will actually enable you to see those extended brightness values that you can't typically see on a standard dynamic range display. But that is not the purpose of this video, so we'll disable EDR and move on to tone mapping. So we can click the tone mapping persona option up here, and Affinity Photo will then get to work finding how to map all of those out-of-bound values back into standard dynamic range. And what we will end up with is the initial result with tone compression set to 100%. So we'll see what that looks like. That actually doesn't look too bad. Let's just drag tone compression to 0. So here's our initial image. And then with mapping the out-of-bound values back into range, it looks like this. Okay, so let's just make a few more tweaks. Let's try some local contrast. With local contrast, it's very easy to overcook or exaggerate the effect. So moderation is key here. Let's add a small amount. And also, I'll just reshape the tones a little bit. So to do this, I'll use curves at the bottom. And let's just add a few nodes here to give the scene a bit more punch and contrast. With tone mapping, it's worth mentioning that it's very easy to get obsessed with trying to make sure all of the values can be displayed. But sometimes that results in an image that's too flat, it's too lifeless, it doesn't have any punch or clarity. And you just need to find a good balance, really. Don't be afraid of having clipped highlight values, because sometimes that may work perceptually within the scene. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this, and all I need to do is click apply to apply that tone mapping, and then I'll move back to the main photo persona, where I can go on to export to a delivery or interchange format like JPEG or TIFF, for example. And there we go, that was just a quick example of how to take one raw image and create a tone mapped HDR look from it.